And the goal is, to have more California red-legged frogs in more places. And so how do you do that? You release a bunch of tadpoles over and over again every year and hope that they grow up. And then you hope that they start acting like natural frogs. And you hope that they start finding each other and breeding on their own. And so that happened, actually. So that was, we found our first wild egg mass in 2017.
This episode is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Untitled Influence, a Californian ecological consulting firm who proudly supports environmental education and all of the diverse conservation efforts that Pelecanes works to highlight. Visit their website at titleInfluence.com to learn more about what they do to conserve our coastal resources and how you can get involved. Hello everyone and welcome to Pelecanes. Pelecanes is a nonprofit organization focused on sharing the movement that is and has been happening in the conservation field. Now this is Conservation Conversations, our long-form documentary-style show that highlights the people and organizations that are making it their purpose to grow the conservation field and to show that people have, and still are, making monumental differences in our world with intentional change. Head over to pelecanes.org to find all of our episodes and more. In this Conservation Conversation episode, we talked to Katy Delaney, a wildlife ecologist for the National Park Service out of the Santa Monica National Recreation Area in northern Los Angeles, California. Among the many things she does, she has been in charge of the reintroduction of California red-legged frogs into their local streams. A federally threatened species listed under the Endangered Species Act, the California red-legged frog has lost most of its historical habitat throughout California and Baja. Their reintroduction into the streams of coastal California and Baja is essential to the survival of the species. Now let Katy describe this forward-thinking conservation project and the species it aims to recover. So you said you're a wildlife ecologist. What does that mean exactly? What kind of projects do you work on?
So the types of projects that I do have to do with wildlife, and they are mostly conservation projects, or they're projects to sort of monitor wildlife where the data can be used to promote conservation in wildlife. And so that's the goal of the National Park Service. One of the mission, it's part of the mission, is to preserve natural resources, meaning wildlife, and other sorts of natural resources, but wildlife is one of them. For the future. And so basically my projects really, especially one of my projects, the red-legged frog reintroduction, is definitely a really on the ground conservation project. But generally we're sort of monitoring wildlife, making sure that the impacts of our urban park are not too detrimental on the wildlife populations. And so that sort of drives all the research questions in our park is the urbanization and fragmentation in the area. So that's a little bit more specific than a wildlife biologist working in another park that might be studying things like climate change or reproduction, or they might be studying hunting or fishing impacts, things like that on wildlife. But we have different sort of stressors here in our park.
So it's all urban interface type projects.
Yeah, we can't help it because our park is it's a mishmash of all sorts of different landowners. So as the National Park Service, we have a boundary for the recreation area, but we only own about 15% of the property within the boundary. So the private property and the impacts of urbanization, so subdivisions, commercial properties and roads are something that we concentrate on, and we study how those things directly impact the animals.
Yeah, so just for the sake of time, I just wanted to transition over to the California red-legged frog work. And I think a good place to start is to just, can you describe the species, just physical characteristics, where the habitat, those kinds of things?
So California red-legged frogs are large. They're the largest native frog in the West. They're true ranid frogs. They're part of Ranidae family. they used to be widespread. So their range used to be from the Bay Area all the way down the coast into Baja, and then there was the distribution that went around sort of into the Eastern Sierra as well. It's kind of unclear where they were or if they were known from the Central Valley, but we have records and everything from them with a sort of very California and Baja California distribution. They're fairly charismatic. They're good-looking frogs. They do have red legs, but the red is underneath their legs, so you have to be really holding one to see the red, and it's usually a wash of sort of pink or red. People are sort of expecting to see one of the, like a tropical species that has like bright red legs, and they don't have that. But they're omnivorous, so they'll eat anything that they can fit in their mouth. But the studies that have been published have shown that they mostly eat terrestrial bugs and terrestrial invertebrates. It takes them, so they breed sort of down here in Southern California. They're breeding pretty early. So they breed with the rain. So they breed January, February. They lay egg masses. Then they're tadpoles for a long time. They're tadpoles until about now, July, August. And so they have kind of a long tadpole phase, several months, and then they become froglets. And so they're I don't know, they're maybe an inch long when they're froglets, right? That when they were like tadpoles of the year, and then they just keep growing until they're adults, and that takes about 3 years, 2 to 3 years. So so when you see a big frog, and they can be 4 to 5 inches long from nose to butt, basically. So they can be pretty large. Females are larger than males, which is sort of a typical amphibian thing. And they're the official California state amphibian, which we didn't have one until a few years ago. And I think like a third grade class or something like petitioned the governor. They got it to be the state amphibian.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting that they take a federally threatened species. I guess that makes sense, though. Get some more awareness around it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's it's a California species. It's not really found anywhere else except for Baja California, and it's rare there too. It's definitely been impacted there from lots of different things. But yeah, it's rare down there as well.
I was just thinking how much I like the term froglet.
I know, isn't that awesome? What about toadlet? Toadlet is awesome too.
Toadlet, and I think it's the same with owls. It's owlet.
Yes, it's like it's the best. And any biologist who pretends that they don't like cute things like that is lying.
I know. It's so funny when you get out of school. Maybe when you're in school, people are like, "Oh, you have to be serious," and then when you get out, all the serious biologists are just like, "Hey, it's froglet."
Exactly.
So we kind of touched on that they're threatened. They're under the endangered species list, and you said they're rare in Baja. So what are the larger conservation issues of why the red-legged frog? I guess why you're doing what you're doing. Like what happened?
Yeah. So that's a big question there, Austin.
I know.
So what happened? Well, so yes, they're listed as threatened under the United States Endangered Species Act. They started being, so they were once very, very common in California, and in Southern California, so we don't really know what happened to them in our area, like why they started becoming so rare. Throughout their range, there's been various things. So throughout their range, they occupy a wide variety of habitats. So in our area, we don't have ponds. We don't have natural ponds. The only natural pond habitat is vernal pools, when we hardly have any of those left. And that wouldn't have been a typical habitat for them. But in like Santa Barbara County, San Luis Obispo County, places like that, there are a bunch of cattle ponds. And that's perfect red-legged frog habitat for them in that part of their range. We don't have that. We have streams. So for instance, in parts of Santa Barbara County and the coastal area and other parts of, a bunch of counties up and down the coast where there are red-legged frogs, they also are stream breeding. So that's what our habitat has always been. And they've existed for millennia, and they were here in our mountains, in the Santa Monica Mountains, in all of the major streams, breeding, living. We have in Southern California, or in, I guess I should just say in the Santa Monica Mountains, we have the stream habitat, and most of it is kind of ephemeral. So it'll dry up. You know, we only get rain in the wintertime. It's a Mediterranean climate. So it'll be wet in the wintertime. That's when they're breeding. And that's when they're really tied to water. And then some of the streams will dry up. But we know that they were in places where there's fairly permanent water. So we do have some streams that flow all year round that are spring fed. For example, we have other streams now that are sort of urban drool water spread. Like that's why there's water year round. And it's probably a combination of spring fed as well. So we don't know what happened in our area. So there's been a paper that was written many years ago about maybe what happened in the Bay Area is that people started eating them. They're really easy to catch and they're apparently delicious. And so people were eating them. And that seemed to be a big impact in like one place in the Bay Area. And I can't remember where that was, but it was one place where people were just coming around the turn of last century and finding that was a great food source. And the paper kind of concluded that they became rarer, and then that's when people started bringing bullfrogs from the southern United States to California to eat and to farm, because they developed taste for frog legs. I don't know if all of that is all true. I should say that, but it is what's in that paper. So we don't think that there was any sort of like human consumption impact in the Santa Monica Mountains. There weren't enough people here at the time. Although Los Angeles was definitely, you know, a big city even then. So we don't really know though, but they were in the Los Angeles River, and we know that people have lived along the Los Angeles River for thousands of years as well. And so, so they coexisted with people at a certain like level. And then we all know what happened to the LA River in the 1930s. It became totally paved over. The urbanization just exploded, especially in the middle of last century. So in the 1940s and 50s. And so that seemed to coincide with the decline of the red-legged frog in this area. Some of the museum samples that I have, or museum records that I know of, they are in the Los Angeles River. There's one that's like pools on Santa Monica Boulevard. You know, there's Santa Monica Boulevard, this major road in the middle of the city, and there were pools and probably farmland, and there probably were frogs there. And so, I mean, they're museum records. So once people started coming in, it's the same old story. The habitat loss associated with that is so that would have totally affected the frogs. The other thing that doesn't explain that though is that we still have these watersheds that are fairly pristine. Those are the watersheds where I'm reintroducing them, right? So it's not like those were, you know, the urbanization was there in the 1950s and now it's gone. It wasn't. So that can't really, so urbanization and people can't really explain their loss throughout their range. So we think it's probably a combination of, it could be a combination of a few things. More natural-ish things like fire. So fire frequency is not natural, but fire is. But it could have been exacerbated with people. But then droughts, and then we think that the fungus, the chytrid fungus, that's really common for amphibians and causes many problems around the world for amphibians. We think that could have swept through the area at one point and affected those populations in the mountains to the point where, and maybe that's a combination with drought or fire and urbanization, maybe in certain watersheds. So that's a long way to say I don't know why they're missing from the Santa Monica Mountains, but we do know that there's chytrid fungus in the source population where we take frogs from to reintroduce them to the Santa Monica Mountains. But and we do know that chytrid can come into a population, and that the populations can, as a collective, can sort of have a resistance or get an immunity to it, to the negative effects of it. And so they'll carry the fungus on their bodies, but it doesn't get to the point where that kills them. And that resistance is the basis of some people's whole conservation projects of trying to get their populations to be resistant to chytrid so they can survive in some of these places. And so that may have just naturally happened in our area. And we have not all of our amphibians, but the frogs that we've tested, they all have, in lots of different areas in the Santa Monicas, have all tested positive for chytrid, and everybody seems like they're doing fine. They got through whatever that was, except for the red-legged frog. The red-legged frog is the only amphibian that didn't make it, and that became so threatened. So throughout their range, that over the last 100 years, their range really restricted. There's only a few places in Baja left where they are. And there's lots of counties in California that don't have them anymore. San Diego County, Orange County, no frogs. Riverside County, there was one place, and now USGS is doing another reintroduction, so there's a little bit more, but that's a different story. But yeah, so it was really Los Angeles County, and the frogs that we were working on was the southernmost population of red-legged frogs in the United States. It's not now because of the other reintroduction, but yeah, they're rare. I mean, they've been found only in a couple places in these counties where they used to be just really common.
Yeah, I think that kind of segues nicely into another large question, open-ended question of the program that you have been involved with with the Park Service.
Yeah.
So again, I know there's gonna be a lot of different directions you could go here, but if you could just kind of give a rough history of how you've identified these problems and what you've done about them, and we can get into the more recent stuff after that.
So red-legged frogs were discovered in the area. So I'll just say near the recreation area boundary. So in the same area, but it's not actually in our boundary, whatever, it doesn't matter. So near the park, they were discovered near the park in 1999 when this parkland, or this privately owned property, was going to be developed into basically a huge city. It was going to be the 8th largest city in Ventura County. And they found red-legged frogs on the property. So that was causing trouble with the project. People developing that whole place, that whole open space, that caused a problem for the landowners. Let's just put it that way. And there were other factors. There was an endangered spine flower found on the property as well. And then there's a lot of community pushback too. They didn't want the 8th largest city right there. So the project got stopped, and actually, so now it's California owned park land. They were discovered on this property. No one knew they were there. And as soon as Fish and Wildlife Service found out about it, there's a Ventura office, and there's specifically a guy named Chris DeLeith, and he worked with the state parks biologist, who was kind of like, okay, we should try to maybe reintroduce these then. If we have this parkland, now it's parkland, it's not going to be developed. We have this population that we've been monitoring now for a few years, and they breed, and they have egg masses, and they breed, and there's lots of tadpoles, and there's lots of frogs in this little area, but there's nowhere for them to go. So they didn't have streams that they could go to nearby. If they were in a stream that is a long stream, but the part that they live in is wet all year long, and then there's big dry stretches, and then there's big channelized sections that go behind neighborhoods and things like that. So there's about 4 kilometers or maybe it's 2 kilometers of just concrete. It's just this concrete culvert so that's not good habitat, right? So they're kind of stuck up in the area that they are. And so Chris and this biologist, and they've been talking about it, and then sort of brought it up with all the stream biologists, and they were having all these conversations that I didn't know about it because I was still at UCLA. And when I got my job, one of my jobs is to monitor stream breeding amphibians every year, not red-legged frogs, but all the other ones. And so they naturally came to me and they said, well, what do you think about reintroducing red-legged frogs? And so I was like, well, tell me everything, because I don't know anything about this. We decided on a protocol based on a successful reintroduction for red-legged frogs at Pinnacles. And a guy named Paul Johnson, a biologist there, he had successfully reintroduced frogs from a stream part of his habitat to a reservoir after he removed all the fish. what he was doing, and what we basically do, is take partial egg masses from the source population, which is doing great. All these egg masses are just sort of like hatching, and there's tadpoles, but there's not enough habitat. So there's some sort of wasted reproductive effort there. It feels harsh to say wasted, but really we thought if we can borrow some of this and put them in a place where maybe they'd be suitable, then they could, that would be the basis of the reintroduction project. And so that's what we do. We transfer egg masses to the streams where they're supposed to be released, and we put them in these tadpole rearing pens, and they hatch in there, and the tadpoles are in there, and we keep the tadpoles in there for a while just to protect them from predators. They grow up for a couple months. We feed them, and we sort of monitor them a couple days a week, and then we release them in the stream. And that general procedure has worked so far. It's been great. But the goal of it, to get back to your big question, the goal of it is basically make more frogs and put them in more places. It's very simple. So that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they write these protection plans, or these, what are they called? Recovery plans.
Yeah.
So species recovery plans, where they outline, these are the things you could do to make more frogs, basically, and put them in more places. And so one of the things is these translocations that we are doing with egg masses. And the goal is, to have more California red-legged frogs in more places. And so how do you do that? You release a bunch of tadpoles over and over again every year, and hope that they grow up, and then you hope that they start acting like natural frogs, and you hope that they start finding each other and breeding on their own. And so that happened, actually. So that was, we found our first wild egg mass in 2017 in one of our sites, and then in 2018 they bred again, and at that site, and then they bred in the other site that we had done. So the procedure or the protocol basically works to get adult frogs, and then we were lucky that the adult frogs started acting like they should and bred.
I think it's in our field, sometimes it's hard to just kind of like, you're only thinking forward and how much work you have to do, but I think it's necessary to look back and say, like, we reestablished frogs. I'm not saying we, but and I'm just thinking about how successful that is, because you took a source population and then you spread it out to all different areas. Yeah. And then you did everything you needed to do to protect them, but over time they created their own populations. That's as cool as it gets in what we do. That's as good as it gets. I mean, I can't think of any other, except like, releasing condors into the wild, and it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's completely amazing. Every single step of the way, every single step of the way, our first egg mass, how do you get a half egg mass? How do you actually harvest a half egg mass? It's the most nerve-wracking thing. You've got this eggs of this endangered species, and you're like, okay, they said just like tear them apart. So and they put them in Tupperware, and then you drive them to the site, and you put them in the thing, and then they actually grow. You can, we're monitoring them, and they're actually growing in their little egg, like, oh my God, there's the tadpoles. So then they hatch, and then we're like, oh my God, they hatched, and then they grow, and then, every single step of the way, it's been amazing. And it's always been something that, I have a little skepticism for. Okay, well, if they don't hatch, then let's see, we'll figure out something else. We'll try to, but it's always sort of worked. And you're right. It's like the most conservation plan you can do, right? These introductions, they're sort of these direct introductions. It's one of the most manipulative and sort of sort of like hands-on ways to save a species. But I actually like our approach, because we're not really, we're just sort of like taking the egg masses and growing them in the place where they're going to be released anyway, and those eggs are sort of growing up there. And so I kind of like that. That was, that's not our idea, but that's what we're doing, and I actually like that. I like that a lot. But you're right, every step of the way has really been a great, I won't say it's a surprise, because obviously you're going to put eggs there and you're hoping they're going to hatch, and not die. But since we don't really know why they became extirpated from the area, you're not really sure if they're gonna survive. And they have, and they do, and they're pretty resilient frogs. I do want to say, because I kind of forgot to say this, I kind of mentioned like pulling together teams and meetings and talking to experts and stuff, but I should say that these aren't just meetings. We actually have a team that works together, you know, to help with this project. And so we have partners with state parks, and Coastal Commission just gave us some funding, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, of course, and USGS, and I'll probably forget some of my partners, but one of the main partners that helps us is Santa Barbara Zoo. So Santa Barbara Zoo is like one of those places where you could actually start growing tadpoles up to be frogs in the zoo, and then put froglets in a stream, which is what actually Yosemite is doing now with San Francisco Zoo and California red-legged frogs in Yosemite. But and the zoo would have been totally willing to do that. But instead, what the zoo is doing, because we don't have that approach, they have donated thousands of dollars worth of their time. So not actual money, but like their time, and their keepers, these amazing people, come and they've gotten training on this species, and they come and they volunteer. Well, they're not volunteering their time. It's part of their work time, which is amazing that Santa Barbara Zoo has a program where their keepers can go in the field. And they come and they'll go out, and they'll be the ones that are feeding the tadpoles that day. And they come out once a week and they help us. And it's a tremendous help. And so I do want to acknowledge that the project, well, they're a great partner because they actually are providing this free labor for us. But they also, it's like all these other people are contributing intellectually and money-wise and support-wise. I just have this great team of people that are just really into the project, and I just couldn't do it at all without them. And it's a group effort.
That's awesome to hear. We hear it a lot, you know, everyone we talk to, you know, even though they're personally doing great work, they're always like, oh, we have a team of 25 organizations, you know, so it's always a team effort. It's always how it has to happen. So it's always good to hear when people are getting along and doing good work.
Yeah. I think it happens more than the other situation, you know. We all are working. So everybody that I know is trying to save the world. So we're trying to, you know, the goal is the same, you know. So yeah, it's great. It really is fulfilling and great to work with a team like that on a project like this.
Yeah, it sounds funny to say it that way, but it's true.
You guys are trying to save the world. I know you are.
Well, yeah, we're just trying to highlight people that are doing the actual work. So you have this successful program where year after year you're introducing tadpoles, and they're growing up, and then they are going on and then reproducing themselves in what you think is the best habitat that can be built into a new population. And do that for a couple of years. And then I believe in 2018, the Woolsey fire happens. How was it affected, and what were you guys able to do to kind of get back on track?
Okay, so now here comes the tear-jerking part of the the story. The tear-jerker part of the story. Let's see. The Woolsey fire happened. So we have 4 introduction streams. 2 of the streams are breeding on their own because they had frogs old enough. Remember, it takes them about 3 years to breed. So, and we kind of delayed. The 2 other streams we had started a couple years later, so they weren't quite breeding age yet. They were going to be breeding age in spring of 2019, but the Woolsey fire happened in fall of 2018. So we had 2 populations that seemed like they were on their way to breeding on their own, and we were going to be starting to make decisions like, should we keep bringing egg masses there? And then we had 2 populations or 2 streams where we were going to be excited to look and see like, oh, this habitat's great. They're ready. They're 3-year-old frogs. They're ready to breed. We've been, you know, bringing tadpoles for 3 or 4 years now, and they're ready. That was where we were right before the fire. The fire happened, and the devastating part of that fire was how big it is. So one of the reasons that we have 4 reintroduction streams is to make more frogs in more places, but we also, those streams aren't right next to each other. They're spread out. So that the thought was, in case there was a fire, or I don't know, an infestation where all the trees died or something would maybe be on one part of the mountains and the other places would be okay. Unfortunately, the Woolsey fire was so huge, the biggest fire, 2.5 times bigger than any fire we've ever on record in the area, that it burned all the sites. And it also burned the source population. So it burned every place where there were red-legged frogs in the area. We went in right after the fire to the source population. Of course, I should say I was on vacation when the fire happened, and I didn't come back for 2 weeks. And so I didn't have the full impact of the fire, but until I come back, and then I did. But I can tell you that my heart really broke for my teams and my hard work for 5 years in those translocation streams where we were going and feeding tadpoles and releasing tadpoles and finding new egg masses for 5 years in these translocation streams, and knowing that all of that was gone was heartbreaking. But you can't focus on that too much because we really needed to make sure that the source population was okay, and because we could start over again if we had to, but we can't start over again if the source population is going to have an issue. So obviously it burned. There's an issue. There's literally no vegetation there. The ground is completely black. The photos are crazy. Fires here, they just burn really hot and they burn all the way to the ground and it's just black. And so the source population, I think I said this before, but it's a small area, and it's about 300 meters of stream, and there's about 10 really deep, nice pools. And that's where they like. They're terrestrial, they kind of come and go, but they like those pools, and that's what they need to breed. So it was totally black, and all the willows had everything was just gone, veg-wise, but there were still the pools there. So we were wondering, not every single frog could have died in this fire. And the area where the source population has burned multiple times. I mean, I think it burned 15 years ago too. Like it's burning multiple times. So we had a pretty good idea that the frogs would survive. But we needed to make sure. So my boss, and then when I got back from my vacation, I went in there several times right after the fire. We went out at night. They're nocturnal, and so the best way to see them is to go out at night with flashlights and count them. And we went out the first night. It was a couple weeks after the fire, like I said, when I got back, and we found something like 89 frogs or something, just like out in the black, on the black landscape. And we're like, okay, well, they're alive. And we went out the following week, and there was 90 frogs or something. So we're like, okay, their frogs are here. They're walking around. It's been maybe a month after the fire. They're still here. Some of them were pretty skinny looking. That was the worry, is that, they eat the terrestrial insects, which sort of, that's, you need plants for insects to be there. And so I was worried so then I was like, okay, well, there's adults there. That's fine. I kind of expected that, but it's good to see. Then I was like, well, they're not going to breed probably. They're going to be all too skinny. They're going to have to survive the winter time. And it started raining immediately, and the vegetation started coming back. And so actually in 2019 in the spring, that population bred like crazy. They did great. We had tons of egg masses. It was awesome. So that kind of shows you the resilience of the species, but it shows that the resilience of that area as well, because that area is sort of rolling hills, and there's not a lot of mud that could come off of the hillsides. So part of the problem with the fire for stream work is that the fire kills all the veg, or not kills it, but it burns all the biomass off. And then if it starts raining, all of that ash and mud comes and water flows downhill, and it goes right into your stream. So we had quite a bit of rain after the fire. And the only thing that we think that this sort of saves that area, and this may be actually why the frogs have survived there and they've survived nowhere else in our area, is that there's these big pools. It's not high gradient. It can burn. The water's permanent. Nobody's in there messing with them, and they're just allowed to sort of breed in there. So when we had runoff, we had a little bit of sedimentation. There was a little bit of sedimentation that would fill up the pools, but within a couple of rainstorms, that was all gone. And so the pools looked fine. they looked like what the frogs were used to, or, you know, what they'd always looked like for years and years and years. So that population seemed to be doing fine. Our other places were not so lucky. So all of the other 4 streams are in really high gradient, steep canyons, and complete burns to the, I mean, the canyons were just completely, like the fire burned really hot through a couple of those places. So what happened with the rain was so all the veg was gone too. So that the vegetation holds the soil up. Now there's no vegetation. So all the soil comes down, and it just basically filled in every pool. So these beautiful breeding pools for the frogs, where I had surveyed for years and years before and said, oh, this is great habitat, the frogs are going to love it in here. Now it does not look like good red-legged frog habitat at all. And I feel bad for the frogs that are sort of stuck there because they don't have any breeding pools. I mean, we have pools that were waist deep, that we had the pens in, you know, the tadpole rearing pens, and waist deep, multiple pools, and they're a shallow trickle of water now. So that's the bad news. The bad news is 3 of the 4 of those places, now it's been about 1.5 years since the fire, are not, or almost 2 years, right? And it's not, they are not recovered. They're not recovered. 3 of the 4 look terrible. Those 3 have adult frogs in them though. So there were frogs that survived. We went and did surveys, and we found about half the number of adults that we found the year before, but they were still there. So there's adults still there, but we can't put tadpoles or eggs there. There's nowhere to put them for the last 2 years. And the adults did not breed in there. They can't find habitat either. So they're there, but they can't, you know, become a population really. It's just a few frogs there. So what we're hoping in those streams is that the rains will come and they'll survive long enough for the pools to come back, because the pools do come back when they get scoured out, but it can take years. And so, you know, pray that this year's not a drought year, because the last 2 years has been good for rain. Now there's more vegetation too, so when it rains, all the sediment won't come down. As much sediment won't come down, but we'll still have some sedimentation issues for years to come. But hopefully those frogs can hang on.
Yeah, on a personal note, it's good to hear about the source population, because I was there. I think I escorted you and your team that first day.
You did,
and it was like we've seen a couple plops, but like we were like, well, we don't, because it was the middle of the day, and you're like, we're gonna have to come back later, and then I left because, you know, end of 2 weeks, and so it's really good to, you know that the whole project isn't done because of one fire.
Yeah. Well, and the good news really is that the one place, it's interesting, the fire burned really spotty through this one canyon. And it's actually our healthiest canyon where we found our first wild egg mass. And so that those frogs are doing really well, and there's a lot of frogs in there. The fire burned around where the frogs were in that case. Very weird. I don't know why that happened. So there was less sedimentation. It burned up in the watershed, so there was some sedimentation, but it wasn't as much. And so those frogs, they didn't breed as much in 2019. They were still stressed, and there wasn't a lot. You know, the water was a little shallower. But with the rains, they bred just as much as they did in 2018 in 2020. So in 2020, they bred fine, and there's big adults there, and they're all doing fine. So that reintroduction site, that we could consider, I mean, I hesitate to say it, but I think it's a success. I think those guys are there. There's a population, they're breeding, and we haven't done anything there for 2 years.
For us, the good news is that you're there. So when you're looking short term into the future, what are your goals and your plans to kind of get either these sites or new sites back on track, and for the species, excuse me? Yeah.
God, that's a good question. Isn't 2020 just like a lot, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, we, for some pandemic reasons, but mostly for habitat reasons, we didn't do a translocation this year. You know, I mean, we looked at the source population, made sure they were breeding, made sure they were fine. They're breeding still. We have eggs. we could have moved eggs, but we have really nowhere to put them. So it's interesting you bring up new sites. I would like to explore that. We have one site in the mountains that from the very beginning, we wanted to do a reintroduction there. The landowners, it was not a private landowner, but it was a land conservation agency. They did not want us to put red-legged frogs there. And so we never had an agreement with them, and we've never had sort of any cooperation with them. I would like to revisit that because their site didn't burn. If we had put them there a long time ago, they would still be there. And it's great habitat. It's really great habitat. It's just sort of controversial. So I need to sort of be like political and maybe explore that a little bit more. But yeah, there's really nothing we can do about the other sites. So, people ask if you can dig out pools and things like that. We actually tried that in 2018 or 2019. In the summer, we dug out some pools, just thinking, okay, well, maybe there'll be some habitat for juvenile frogs. And, there was a pool there. It wasn't very big. It's a lot of work. You can't get a very deep pool. You can't get any heavy equipment in these canyons. I mean, it's just way too rugged. So, there are places where people have done that, where after a fire, they'll go in with a big machine, or so whatever those things are called anyway, something to dig big ponds, and they'll be, okay, here's streams over here, and then there's a big field or something right next to the stream, so let's dig a pond over here and it'll naturally fill with water. And the frogs have used it, not in our area, but this is in another area that someone did this about 20 years ago, and it worked. The frogs went to those ponds, and that kind of saved them while the stream regenerated. Now the stream's fine. The ponds are kind of still there, but they really mostly use the stream. We just don't have an area like that where you can, these really, really narrow canyons, and there's nowhere to sort of get in there and dig them. So it's really, I feel helpless. There's really nothing we can do to restore the stream. And people have offered, like, we have money, Katie, if you can figure out how we can fix the streams, we will help you with anything. And it's just not, we just can't. So if you dig out pools, so what we did is in 2019, we dug out some pools, and in first rain, they just filled right back in. So it's not ever going to be, and we knew that was going to happen, but we made them specifically for like a winter refugia, but it's just not, we need them to breed, that's what we want them to do. So we can't create breeding habitat. We can just hope that it recovers soon. And in other areas, fires, the streams have recovered within like 5 years of a fire. So, and that one of the places it was even drought. And so it sort of recovered after maybe like 6 or 7 years. So maybe this only 2 years after the fire, maybe 1 or 2 more years. But to know that the source population is there, we can start over if we have to.
It's not all lost.
Yes, it's not all lost. Thankfully.
Again, like I said, our good news story is the fact that you guys are there, and that you have that team, and you have people that are like, if you can find a way for us to put our money, we'll pay for it. And that is honestly the biggest issue for a lot of programs, is they're just trying to get people involved. So the fact that you have that is gives you hope for if the population can survive the next few years. So I guess that kind of transitions into like the last thing that we kind of like to talk about. And we based this off of the Michael Soule quote, where he was asked if he's optimistic or pessimistic, and he said he likes to consider himself possibilistic, or he likes possibilism, where if you have a team like you have, and you have all the PhDs and all the graduate degrees and all these people going, I have money, I'll give it to it. If you have all that, like you can kind of accomplish anything. And so I guess with that said, and in your experience, what gives you hope? What gives you inspiration? What keeps you up, getting up in the morning to do this? I would say go to work, but you're just probably changing rooms now.
Yeah, I'm in my guest room right now. That's my office now. I tell you, my motivation is definitely taking a hit this year. Actually last year too, since the fire, really. The fire, even though I can be optimistic now, way more optimistic now, 6 months after the fire than I was a couple weeks after the fire, let's say. We know a lot more now. That always helps. We know that there's frogs in all the places still. That gives me hope. That makes me motivated to keep going. I have a responsibility. I and my team put those frogs there, and I have a responsibility to do as much as I can, which is not a lot, but as much as I can to make sure that they survive. So that means we have to go in there and we have to survey. We have to make sure that there's not like new impacts from hikers or weird things being dumped in the streams. And so we have to sort of keep monitoring them. We have to go out at night. We have to monitor them. We want to count them. We want to make sure that they're healthy. We want to swab them for chytrid. We want to make sure, that's one of the things I just got some money for, to do a study where we can swab the frogs for chytrid and really get an idea of how much of the fungus we have here and what strains and what loads the frogs have, which I think will be a helpful piece of the puzzle to know for going to the future. I mean, I'm motivated by, I feel like it's my responsibility to keep the project going, and the project probably wouldn't have I did this, I have to keep it going. Like I feel a responsibility to the project. So yes, daily motivation can be hard right now, and not being able to see or meet with any of my colleagues in person, and interns or biotechs, I had to let my interns left, and I can't rehire anybody because I can't be with them to train them. And so Santa Barbara Zoo volunteers, they're out there and they want to, these great people, they want to help, but I'm like, we can't do anything. Come out with us at night when we go out, but there's no tadpoles to feed. So, but I feel a responsibility to keep the project going, and that is what's motivating me at the moment. I think it starts really young. I think you have to be inspired and passionate. I don't know. For me, it started by watching like documentaries with my dad, like marine, like Jacques Cousteau, and just like I'm old, so that used to be on TV, like when I was young. And it was just fascinating to me. And then, moving to San Diego when I was 11 from Detroit, and having like, the beach there, and thinking about all the things that were living in the ocean. And it's just, and I was not, wasn't necessarily a great like student. I didn't know what I was going to do and all that. Like, didn't know about going to college and where I was going to do. And these interns that I have now, though, that come through, it's a very different time, and I just grew up in a different family. They have these families that are encouraging them to do these things, and it just they're inspired by the animals that they love, or they're and because I get a bunch of people that are interested in animals, not trees necessarily, but that's some people's things. We had one intern that came through, then her thing is like parasites, like that's what she's into, dead stuff and parasites, she's just into it. But yeah, I think you get inspired as a young person. It has to start young, and you have to have some kind of incredible sense of empathy. And I actually think that there's like a sense of like morality and justice, that we should be doing this, that not everything's about you. It's not about you. It's about us. It's about the whole planet. And now more than ever, conservation and conservationists, as you say, are increasingly worried about, climate change, which is the biggest issue facing us. And the conservation movement isn't that old. 100 years, and it's not that old. And so, but what you're getting is you're just getting these issues are getting bigger and bigger, and the issues are higher and higher stakes, and kids are growing up knowing about that. And I think they are growing up caring about it. You're either I feel like you either care about it, or there are people who just want to, what's in it for me type of thing. So that's why I say it's like a sense of empathy and morality and justice of what's right, doing what's right. Let's not ruin this for everyone kind of a thing.
We want to say thank you again to Katy Delaney for speaking with us, and for all the hard work she does for this and other local species. Host for your episode is Austin Parker, and producers for this episode are Austin and Taylor Parker. The music was provided by A Picture Book. You can find all of our podcasts at pelicanus.org, on YouTube, as well as the podcast provider of your choice. If you don't mind, please like and subscribe to our page, and thank you again for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.